So in terms of intervals, all we're talking about is the actual distance between any two notes. There are some intervals that we're already pretty comfortable with. Since we've been talking about scales, we're pretty comfortable with things like steps. We talked about whole versus half steps too. In terms of steps, that's talking about an interval's size. So size would be the term like second. What lies a second above C? That would be D. The interval of a second is synonymous with the term step we've been using. But we've talked about different kinds of steps, right? There have been whole steps versus half steps. And making that discernment right there is the difference between talking about an interval size versus an interval's quality. Whole and half steps are both steps. They're both seconds, but they have different qualities. Let's start, before we get much further, by going over interval size, and then we can come back to quality. When it comes to intervals and determining the space between two given notes, there are two ways they can come across. You may be listening to a piece or a song and hear as in like it's part of a melody. You had one note first and then the other note second. And you can almost even kind of imagine the melody I played, the two-note melody, as having this distance between them. I first played this note, and then I played that one. And between the two was a space. And as you can see by that arrow on the board, between C and E, there's a vertical dimension to that. E lies above C, and there's also a horizontal one. C came first in time, E came second. You could also stack these two and play them simultaneously. Like this. So the only difference here is that this one took place in time. It's a melodic interval. And this one, in that case, they were played together, a harmonic interval. And you can sort of imagine this having moved up to the second note as opposed to them sounding together in the harmonic one. Before we go over steps and seconds just a little bit more, there's one thing that I should make clear, and that is what happens if you have two notes that occupy the same line or space. So, for example, remember we're still in treble clef here. If I were to have a C followed by another C, then I wouldn't really have moved anywhere. There's no real space between one instance of C natural versus the another one, except for the fact that maybe one came before the other. But if I were to say, make this a C sharp, okay, now I have two different notes. I've necessarily opened up a space between those two. Now this space couldn't be much smaller. What kind of distance do I really have between C and C sharp? It's a half step, right, yeah. One lies here, and the second one lies here. But technically, this wouldn't constitute the interval of a second in the same way that you have a bunch of seconds in a scale, C to D. Yeah, that's a second, D to E. These are seconds because they occupy adjacent letter names. You have to move from C to D, from D to E. But here we're still talking about C in both instances, just C versus C sharp. In this case, this would actually be called a unison. Two notes occupying the same space and line there. Even though technically, yes, it is a half step. What could I do to keep the same exact sound, this one, but notate it so that I actually wind up with a step or a second. Sorry, not a step, it's still a half step, but notate it so that I actually wind up with a second on the board. Exactly, yeah, that's, and so you would have like, okay. Now you have a second because they occupy adjacent places on the staff there. So they may sound the exact same. I'll prove it to you real quick. Here's C to C sharp versus C to D flat. Right? They sound the exact same, but they have different labels here. They're notated differently because they are inharmonic equivalents. Good. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about seconds then over here on the board. You're already pretty familiar with this, so I won't spend too much time here. But from C up to D, each one of these has a distance between the two. So you're talking about not just the note C and the note D, but the passage between them. There was a famous music theorist named Ernst Kurt. You don't have to know much about him. I won't be quizzing you over history of theory in here. But if you're curious on his last name, it's spelled like this. And one thing he was really focused on wasn't so much music in terms of printed score with those actual notes on them. To him, that just represented these certain pinpoints in time in a piece, where the real energy lied was whatever happened between those two. This sort of transformation that was taking place from one pinpoint to the next. And so you get that kind of energy building up here from C up to D. Remember, this is sort of gravitational metaphor we keep thinking about that we always take for granted when we talk about notes being higher or lower than the one that came before. So, for instance, when you're going from C up to D, there's this sort of lifting, this uptick that happens between the two notes there. Which kind of second do I have here? We talked about things in terms of whole step or half step, but if I were to ask you if I have a major second or a minor second, which one do you think I have here? Yeah, a major second, right? A whole step is basically synonymous with the term a major second, and a half step would be a minor second. Don't get them confused too much with major versus minor keys, right? That's a whole different realm there. When we talk about keys, we're talking about a big network of pitches and the relationships between them. Here we're just talking about the space between two notes. So whole step would be synonymous with major second. Good. Okay, from D to E, I think we're all pretty familiar with that one too, another major second. So then what kind of second do you have from E up to F? Minor. Yeah, that would be a minor second because they lie a half step apart. Good. So major seconds versus minor seconds. Okay, so that's pretty much all you need in order to have a second. Two notes that lie on adjacent lines or spaces. And remember too that there's one more instance of steps of seconds that we've at least touched on a couple times. Besides minor and major, there's also one other kind we've touched on.
Augmented?
Yeah, the augmented second. And that's a second that actually spans 3 half steps. If I wanted to create a, say an augmented second here between C and D, what could I do here?
Sharp.
Sharp, which one? D, yeah. And now you've traversed the space from C to C sharp to D, and then D to D sharp. And that's the biggest kind of second you really are ever going to see. It's an augmented second. Not that common, but definitely something we see in, say, the harmonic minor scale we've already seen. Good. Okay, let me go back to the original C and D. There's one other way to have created an augmented second here besides sharpening the D. What could I have done?
Flattered the C.
Yeah, I could have flattened the C, and then also you would have had 3 half steps within what's technically still a second interval. Good. Okay, so there are a number of these in every scale: major seconds, minor seconds, and augmented seconds. And I think based on how many times you've heard me play a scale and how many times we've sung one by way of solfege, you're probably pretty comfortable with how these sound. Nonetheless, it can be useful to at least try and discern them outside the context of just a scale. We're so used to hearing that pattern that we know we're in the middle of a C major scale even when we're halfway through it. We can discern where it's going to go because we know the whole thing together. But let's practice just trying to discern between a whole step versus a half step, aka a major second versus a minor second real quickly. I'll play you a few on the piano, and then I want to hear what you think about which one you actually have going here. So, just to review, your major scale starts with the whole step, aka a major second, from Re to Mi and then Mi to Fa is a half step. And then another half step here from T to Do. So, half step, whole step. But now I'm going to move outside this film and let's see how well we do. Here's your first one. I'll play it as a melodic interval. What do you think? Raise your hand if you think you heard a major second. And then raise it for a minor second. Okay, I didn't see everybody raise their hand, so maybe you could use one more hearing. Let's try that. All right, so raise your hand again if you think it was a major second. And then minor second. Good. Okay, good. Yeah, don't be shy. Even if everybody besides you raises their hand, I still want you to raise it loud and proud if you're the only one, because I want to know where we all stand, okay? So this is tricky, especially when you start to move outside of a scale you're used to hearing. Whole or half? Well, one way I've used to help me discern these in the abstract is to think about it this way. Whenever I hear a major scale, be that C, D, E, whatever, I'm really used to how it starts out, that whole do, re motion, right? if you were to say, think of this first note I played as do, does this sound like re? Yeah, that's one way I kind of used to do that. And in fact, this was a major second from D flat to E flat. Maybe you could have thought of it as C sharp to D sharp if I played them together as a harmonic. Okay, let's do a couple more. Raise your hand for major second and minor second. Okay, good. So most of us are on the major second one. Again, think of it this way. If this is do, can everyone sing re? Yeah, this must be a major second from G up to A in this case. Okay, what about raise your hand for major second and minor second? Okay, yes, most of us are on the minor second realm. And there's a slightly different kind of sound to that. There's a different kind of quality. If you're to imagine this first note as do, re doesn't quite sound like the note that follows. If I were to have played a major second above this note, you would have heard as in do, re, but instead you have this half step. And it's a little bit cliche, but that's actually what it kind of marks the theme from the movie Jaws, that even if you haven't seen it, you're still familiar with the whole. Keeps getting faster. It's a creeping little sound, that half step, especially when you put it down there in a lower register there. Good. Okay, so let's try this a couple more times and then we'll move on. But one thing I'm going to do this time is start to play them as harmonic intervals, not melodic ones. So let's try this. This is a little bit tricky, but before we decide on whether we have a major or minor second, can we try and sing these two notes as a melodic interval, the lower and then the higher note? Try it. I'll give you 2 counts, and then I want you to sing the lower and then the upper note. 1, 2. Good, good. Major second or minor second? Yes, yeah. Good. If I were to have played a minor second, it would have sounded a bit more harsh. Right? That's a pretty different sound right there. Good. Okay, maybe just a couple more examples. I'll try doing one here. What do you think, major or minor second? It's a little hard to tell in this register. Yeah, this is a minor second. Good, good. Okay, so that's one thing you can keep practicing on if you're working with the keyboard too, is turning that certain sound, whole versus half step. And the more practice you get, you don't necessarily need to go through the steps of thinking to yourself, does that sound like do to re, or does that sound like T to do? You just sort of take on a certain characteristic sound, color that you can identify pretty quickly. But enough about seconds. We've done that a lot already. Let's talk about what you might logically think is the next one, thirds, right? And thirds we're also pretty familiar with. After all, we spent part of some previous days talking about things like the tonic and the mediant, and the tonic and the submediant below that. So thirds are basically spanning the distance of 2 steps from C to D and D to E. If you take the whole thing together, C to E, then you have a third on your hands. The same thing from D through E up to F, E through F up to G. And so if you're to think about the trajectory between those 2 notes, it's a little different now. You have actually gone further up, and if you play them as a harmonic interval, then they not only look different, but sound different too. So for example, if I were to put a harmonic third above C, then you can see they're both on lines. Or above F, or above D, and F, they're both occupying spaces, etc. There are a ton of thirds in any given scale as well. There's a third, as we already talked about, from C to D, from D to F, from E to G. And I've kind of illustrated those on the staff below that. Each one of these represents a third on the way up. And then you step back down, and then you go a third up again. Essentially, what you can imagine here is that I have a C major scale written out, but each scale member, each scale degree, has a melodic third written above it. Let's try singing through this one. We've already talked so much about scales and solfege, right? Well, let's do the same thing here, but adding in the solfege syllable ourselves as we go. So just as a refresher, then, as we get started, you would be going from do to mi, re, fa, mi, sol, etc. And as we go, once you get past the first few notes, you're going to hear this pattern taking on shape, just like you would if we were to be singing a scale. So it becomes a bit more intuitive. Nonetheless, let's try singing through this. So let me give you your tonic note. Or if you're in my range, the do is down here. And I'll give you 4 counts, and then we'll sing through this this whole thing together here. All right, ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. Do, mi. Okay, good. We were a little bit nervous about doing the whole thing without maybe me singing along the whole time. So how about I'll sing along the whole time through you instead of just trying to listen to see where we're going. So let's also try this first. Let's get a little bit more comfortable in terms of how it's going to sound at first. If this is do, or can you all sing mi above that one? Mi, yes, good, mi, re, do, mi. If this is do, can you sing re? Now moving from re, can you sing fa? Good, okay, so let's try this once more. 1, 2, 3, 4. Do, mi, re, fa, mi, sol, fa, la, sol, ti, la, do, ti, re, do. Good. And then if you have any sort of choral background, then you probably wanted to start going down the same way we just went. You can start to intuit that pattern pretty well. Good. Okay, so one thing I do want to point out before we get much further is part of your reading assignment covered page 232 of your textbook. There's just a quick typo to address there. On page 232, it says that a third spans 3 steps, but it doesn't. A third spans 2 steps, right? From C, D, and then D to E. So just keep that in mind on page 232. It should say a third spans 2 steps. Good, okay. The same thing now can be done with any of these leaps, right? Once we move to a third, we move from steps to leaps. Anything bigger than a step is a leap. And so we essentially we spanned over D and then got to E. We spanned over E here and went from D straight to F. And the same thing will start to happen with fourths as well. Fourths are pretty common intervals that you're going to be used to hearing in a lot of music. But think about it this way. A real common fourth, one of the most common ways you hear it is actually maybe like a downward one that moves up. Or you sometimes even a lot of songs start with an upward fourth as well. But one of the most common fourths is this one, between sol and do, either going up or down. You may have heard in a lot of examples this kind of sound. Right, that sort of jaunty little tune, that interval from do down to sol. It's important. We've talked about how important the relationship between do and sol is, and that's where the fourth will come across, right here, in terms of that one. Also, as Longhorns, you're probably used to right? Well, Isa Texas actually starts with a fourth from F up to B flat is the one I just played. But if I were to play the same thing with G to C, you would have heard the same exact sound. So fourths are pretty common. Then you can imagine moving from fourth to fifths, say from do to sol, from fifths to sixths. So what solfege would be involved there from do up to what? La, that's one. Or you could also go from re up to what for a sixth? To T, from mi to do. What I'm getting at is sixths and sevenths are all somewhere in that scale. Now, as you move up through smaller, from smaller to bigger intervals, you'll find fewer and fewer of those in a scale. So for example, there's a ton of seconds, right? A lot of thirds too. When you start to map out the fourths, well, this can only go down so many times before you reach your C again. Fifths, and then sixths and sevenths, etc. And then I know we've touched on this before, but we haven't really explicitly defined it. What's the interval between this do and this one here? There's an octave. Yeah, good. And there's really only one of those in a scale. Good. Okay, so when we come back next time, what we'll do is we'll start to discern not just the size of intervals. We can practice those more, but we'll also start to talk about the quality. And we'll notice there are definitely big differences in quality. All we're talking about is major versus minor seconds or thirds. These are things that only differ by a half step, a minor second, right? But nonetheless, we will see that there are some interesting associative qualities with each one of those. Besides that, which was part of the reading assignment, and then just preparing for Friday's quiz, that'll be it. So I'll see you on Wednesday.